Next speaker is our good friend Dr. Vijay Shetty from Mumbai, India. He currently works as the head of anesthesia at the Fortis Mullen Hospital, Mumbai. He is very well known for being part of the team which conducted the first successful heart transplant and heart lung transplant in Western India. He has an experience of more than 100 plus cardiac transplant in 4 years. We have great pleasure in introducing Vijay Shetty to you, who also serves as the secretary of Mumbai Anesthesiologist Society and conducts the very popular meeting called the MASCON. Over to Dr. Vijay.
This is Dr. Vijay Shetty, and I'm going to be speaking on tips and thoughts, 2 decades in cardiac anesthesia. No disclosures for me. And I'm really missing the positive vibes of the Ganga GARC, which I'm fortunate, it's my good fortune to be attending for the past few years now. I have a lot of good memories of GARC, and I'm really missing them. I bring you greetings from Fortis Hospital, Mumbai. I'm part of a wonderful team which does a lot of high-risk work, cardiac transplants, routine transplants, liver transplants, kidney transplants, traumas. And I'm going to be speaking on some aspects of the heart which I thought I should be highlighting based on my experience for the last 2 decades. When I started my business in anesthesia, it was that any patient with a bad heart is going to be a very high risk for perioperative event that was given, but we didn't know what the quantum of risk. Now we know that the cardiovascular complications are responsible for roughly one half of the complications that occur in a patient who's undergoing a non-cardiac operation. It is my endeavor that all anesthetists should be, it is my hope that and wish that every anesthetist should be well versed with what is happening to the heart at all points in time. After all, it is responsible 50% of your complications. So let me introduce you, or if you're aware, just me refresh these three terms. Myocardial injury, simply when the cardiac troponin levels are above the 99th percentile. Myocardial ischemia is when there is a lack of blood supply to the myocardium, which if left uncorrected can lead to glycogen depletion and myofibril relaxation and sarcolemmal disintegration, leading to a myocardial infarction. And the definition of myocardial infarction is anybody with a myocardial injury, that is elevated cardiac enzymes of a sufficient magnitude, and on the background of evidence of acute myocardial ischemia. For example, chest pain, ECG changes, or 2D echo changes of or a new regional wall motion abnormalities. Now, what is the risk of somebody who's undergone non-cardiac surgery and developing a subsequent ischemia? Because we are all worried about sending the patient home, and he should not have he should not have a cardiac event at the end of a surgery which went off very pretty smoothly. In this study of Dr. Elwani of more than 2 lakh patients, and he found 146, studied their angiogram which was done after non-cardiac surgery to see if they had a type 1 or type 2 myocardial infarction. Just to refresh, type 1 is the typical acute coronary artery disease where there's a plaque built up, an unstable plaque which ruptures, and suddenly the thrombosis level is so much that it causes acute occlusion and a big infarct. Type 2 is where there's a myocardial oxygen supply demand imbalance because of either plaque which was not obstructive, but when given sufficient stress, it can lead to oxygen demand supply imbalances. It can be because of some coronary arteries which go into spasm. It can be because of some dissection, a small dissection that occurs. And as you can see, it can be because of in a perfectly normal blood vessel, coronary blood vessel. The stress of the demand, oxygen supply demand, is so much that when sufficiently stressed, even somebody with a normal coronary artery can develop a ischemia. In this particular study, they found 3 out of the 4 events, that is 5% of the times, it was not the acute plaque rupture, but it was a demand ischemia. It was an oxygen supply demand problem, leading and presented as a non-ST segment elevation. And 1 in 4 patients had no evidence of obstructive artery disease, and a few patients had even stress-induced cardiomyopathy, and there was sufficiently high mortality associated with these. And if you see a patient of yours who undergoes a non-cardiac surgery, he will be in one of these 3 phases. Either he would have sustained no detectable myocardial injury, or he might present with a perioperative myocardial infarction. There is a good number of patients who develop myocardial injury. That means there is a sufficiently high increase in the cardiac troponin levels, which in normal circumstances would have qualified as a myocardial injury. And this is important because a lot of our patients share a lot of common parameters, like, for example, heart failure, chronic kidney disease, or recovering heart failure. These patients already have elevated cardiac troponin. but it is a rise and a fall, because we always confuse about a perioperative ischemia, whether to call it a cardiac event or not. There should be sufficient rise and fall in the cardiac enzymes for it to be detected. Let's see this part. This is the cardiac troponin level. You can see the cardiac troponin levels are pretty much stable, not fluctuating. This happens in chronic myocardial injury, for example, in cardiomyopathy, end-stage renal disease, critical illness, sepsis. These are all common accompaniments of anybody who's working in a tertiary care hospital. But it requires this rise and fall of the enzymes for it to qualify as a type 1 or type 2 myocardial infarction. That is what happens here. What I'm trying to say is that there is a sufficient cardiac illness which is present in all these patients who otherwise we would not be looking at very closely to see if they were having a myocardial ischemia. And this is one term I want to leave you with, is MINS, is myocardial injury after non-cardiac surgery. It happens in 8% of patients above 45 years undergoing non-cardiac surgery. That is a high number of patients who have a myocardial injury after non-cardiac surgery. And this was in this study, they found that this 8% patients had elevated cardiac troponins, and only 1 in 6 patients had ischemic features on ECG or symptoms. So without the troponin levels being measured, you would have missed 85% of this. And this is a very important quote, and this is important that we going ahead, we have plans in place to detect these kind of patients who are going to go home and sustain a myocardial injury or have a myocardial injury and would have complications in the post-op. For example, continuing or starting statins, or making sure they're monitored well, having a beta blocker or calcium channel blocker or a R1 board. Maybe even starting this dabigatran, in which in this managed trial has showed a good prognosis for patients who had sustained MINS. Heart rate has been very close to us at all points in time. And a patient who has unexplained tachycardia is always a cause of concern, rightly so, because this study showed that by Abbott in the BJ8, it showed that in about, that if you have a heart rate, the patient has a heart rate of over 96, it would mean that there is probably a higher chance of these patients having MINS associated with this. So myocardial injury after non-cardiac surgery is a big entity, and we need to keep our eyes open for it and have some plans in place. So we as anesthetists have a potential to make a significant impact in the periop, because we need to accurately stratify the patient, understand the pathophysiologic mechanisms, and prevent organ injury by promptly detecting this. So this stratification, I'll not go into details, but the important things that the 2014 and subsequent guidelines and other societies have showed is that knowing the surgical risk, the functional capacity, and the urgency or the emergency of the operation is good place to start. Add additional pharmacological testing, but at all points in time, involve the patient in decision making. For example, you wouldn't want the patient to go all the whole trial till the coronary angiography, and the patient says, now I don't want angioplasty, but I want the surgery instead. If we had talked to the patient at the initial part, this part would have been very, very, very clear. And also there are some risk scores, like for example, the LEAS simple index is very, very easily available as an app even. And just knowing these parts about the patient's risk of is the surgery a high-risk surgery? Is the patient having ischemic heart disease, congestive cardiac failure, cerebrovascular disease, or preoperative treatment with insulin, or high serum creatinine? Just the increased number of factors that become positive, higher is the risk. It's a great place to also be able to see. So a risk of excessive focus, I just want to point out that once we have a cardiac patient, we all focus on heart rate and blood pressure, but we forget a lot of things that are happening around it. For example, this is my experiment in the lockdown where I tried to make what we call as a chapati here. And so much was my focus on preventing the tea being boiled over, which was my previous days' failures, that I forgot to keep a watch out on this. And this is a perfectly ruined breakfast. This is the same thing can happen in anesthesia when you're so much focusing on something and you forget to look after hypotension or hypovolemia, bleeding, anemia, or shivering. Maybe good pain, acute pain control is not good, or any time there's perioperative hypoxia, hypercapnia can lead to depression. So remember, most of the MIs that are happening in our operation theater are because of supply demand. That is one thing I want you remember. In spite of our best efforts, it might not come. This is a 35-year-old patient who had a glossectomy, neck dissection, tracheostomy, very high-risk operation, high-level operation. His old angio about 6 months back had shown a triple vessel disease. He had refused treatment for that. He had, you can see the intraoperative is pretty much a very good, well-conducted case. He went to the ward, and the fourth day during suctioning, he developed these changes with chest pain. He became unresponsive. He was put on the ventilator, and IABP was put, and angioplasty was conducted on his culprit vessels. He recovered quite well, but these are the things that can happen in spite of the best care. So the perioperative MI is just around the corner. In spite of your best management, in the operation theatre. What happens to the patients who have prior coronary stents? We know that there's a dual antiplatelet regime for to be continued, and only emergency patients can be done. And this study tried to evaluate what happens to patients who have coronary stents and then they undergo a non-cardiac surgery. We can see that the incidence of the major adverse cardiac events, death, myocardial infarction, cardiac arrest, or stroke, all these are extremely high if the patient were to operate it. It is the proximity of the operation to the stent event that determines, and the closer we are to the stenting, the more the likelihood the complications are. The case in point is one. Both these cases occurred in the last week itself, so I thought I'll just pull them up. 80-year-old patient for urgent operation for obstructing paracolostomy hernia. This is his pre-operative ECG is quite okay. And 10 hours just prior to the operation, he developed chest pain and significant ECG changes. And his angiography showed tight lesions, which needed to be addressed. The angioplasty was done, the ECG changes reverted normal. Patient was doing pretty well. But what now? It's an urgent operation. The dual antiplatelets can't be stopped. There's a risk of MI, bleeding, death, as we saw in the previous slides. So multidisciplinary team was called, and given the urgent nature of the operation, within 2 days the patient was operated with just and with a good result. It was uneventful surgery. This is a snapshot of the intraoperative monitor, and he's doing well. But we know that he's not out of the woods, because we need to make sure that he is good for the next few weeks before we can congratulate ourselves. What are the things that get missed out in all this grading of the risk in all this hypertension? Now we are looking for this green zone, which is between the hypotension and the hypertension, the zone of pressure autoregulation, where the organ blood flow is maintained over wide pressure ranges, ranges of the map. And this is probably pushed more towards the right in the hypertensive patients. Just a few words about this, because BP is one of the most commonly monitored parameter in our operation theaters. If you're not going to manage it well, these are the problems. Not only it increases morbidity, mortality, and hospitalization, but organs like kidney, heart, liver are at risk. Also, there is a poor outcome in very high risk operation, for example, in post-esophageal anastomotic leak. Many studies have shown it's rather than the hypertension, it is the hypotension, which is associated with the increased 30-day mortality, operating mortality and morbidity. And that is why we are much more focused on BP monitoring. It is surprising that there are a lot of regimes about how to monitor and manage BP in the outpatient, but intraoperative, how to manage the BP and what are the targets is not very well given. This is an attempt by the European guidelines, which tries to tell us that any patient with the hypertension, we need to be looking out for the hypertensive associated organ damage. And this is one thing that we need to recommend, because it gives us the opportunity to pick up treatable causes of hypertension as well. And it also recommends that any patient with BP of less than 180 or diastolic pressure less than 110 probably could go, but we have to do it on a day-to-day basis. Abrupt stoppage of beta blockers obviously is not allowed. So determination of BP target, we need to see how high can I allow the BP to go so that there is no bleeding risk, and how low can I allow the BP to go so there is no organ ischemia. Now that depends on the correct preoperative BP, which is a very elusive number for us. So if that were properly available to us, probably we could give a recommendation like this based upon whether the patient's BP is high or low. How much can I allow the BP to rise or fall so that organ ischemia and the bleeding both are taken care of. Now, one more thing that I want to just highlight is the diastolic dysfunction. For example, you'll find the patient, the 70-ish patient who comes with complaints of breathlessness. You don't know if it's a lung issue or the heart issue or general aging issue, but it is definitely an aging issue. And diastolic dysfunction, diastolic heart failure are a lot of research is going on, a lot of studies are going on. In diastolic heart failure, you have signs and symptoms of congestive heart failure. The EF, maybe the systolic EF, which we all focus upon in our 2D course, might be preserved or might be marginally reduced. And there is abnormal LV relaxation, a part of which is an active component as well. So the risk factors, when you look at a patient in an OPD and you see an elderly person, an elderly woman especially, and she might have factors like ischemic heart disease, systolic hypertension, renal insufficiency, diabetes, and atrial fibrillation, tiredness, fluid overload. These are all small signs which tell us that the patient might be at risk for diastolic heart failure. Diastolic dysfunction might be present, and even BNP or pro-BNP or these markers might tell you about that they might be in that risk. This is because of the aging system. Our lecture is there on the geriatric population, and I think this would have been covered there. And management of diastolic dysfunction is one big skill. At the same time, we know that these usual suspects of shivering, anemia, hypoxia have to be avoided. And this, what is in italics, are the things which are always many times associated. We need to make sure that these don't get worse. You don't worsen the ischemia. Hypovolemia should be treated, and hypovolemia should be avoided. Avoid tachycardia. So usually you are taught about rule of 7. In patients who are above 70, make sure the diastolic BP is above 70, and the pulse pressure, the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure, should be less than 70, and try to keep a heart rate around 70. Milrinone, levosimendan, and the combination of phenylephrine that we mentioned in the previous slide are things to look at. So in everyday practice, keep a low threshold for arterial blood pressure monitoring. This is one thing that I think should be done by all anesthetists. Make your anesthesia plan well in advance. Decide targets and try to stay close to them. Do not ignore temperature and post-operative pain management. IV fluids are drugs. Don't forget, use them as such, especially in patients with diastolic dysfunction. And echo, we need to embrace it. I just give a few examples of my routine practice as I look into the non-cardiac patients also. This is one case who was a section who had come in, somebody detected a murmur on it, and when putting the transfusoric echo, we realized that the patient has very small aortic murmur, aortic regurgitation, and a small mitral regurgitation as well. This patient would not give us any trouble in any form of anesthesia that were to be administered. This is an emergency craniotomy with a significant murmur, and this revealed to us that there is a big amount of mitral leak that is happening, a significant mitral regurgitation. So we have some plans about how to manage mitral regurgitation. We can go ahead and conduct these cases with those targets in mind. So you get visualization of the lesion itself is a big comfort to us, because otherwise we're running blind in these cases. In this case, you can, this is a very interesting case again for a patient to come for chemo, but you can see this is the heart action. This is a big pericardial effusion, which is lying just above the right ventricle here, surrounding the heart. And if one more, I just said that's one more last is a COPD patient with laparoscopy surgery. This is how the normal heart looks in the short axis, in the mid-pap view, in the transthoracic. I'm not even speaking with transesophageal, and there's immense potential. Just learning the transthoracic echo will be a great boon for anesthetists. You just learn 4 or 5 views, and I can guarantee you that 90 to 95% of cardiac lesions, which are important for you, you'll be able to detect. In this, you can see hardly any RVS. In this normal echo, in this patient, you can see a hugely dilated right ventricle, a big pulmonary artery circling here. And you can see the size of the right ventricle is 2 or 3 times the size of the left ventricle. Obviously, this patient is sort of going to cor pulmonale, and right ventricular function is going to be discussed by my good friend Dr. Ranjit in the coming lecture. So please stay tuned for that as well. And so in the end, I want to add with something that I've learned this last few years, is that the heart never gives up. This is a patient with a transplanted heart. The old heart has come out, it is in the bin. You can see it is still beating. The heart never gives up, and neither should you give up trying to be a better anesthetist for the sake of the heart. I wish you all the best, and have a good time at the GARC 2020. Thank you very much.